Something I think that's really crazy, and this is something I believed in, 20 years ago, into the 90s, somewhere around there, is the dry doe myth. And hunters feel that if a doe has fawns, that they should not take that doe, and if it doesn't have fawns, we should take that doe because it's not having any fawns anyways. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I learned that from a leading research biologist up in the UP of Michigan, first name John, but a long time ago. And in that case, he basically told me that if a doe could not have fawns, it was probably going to die. It was severely injured. It was diseased, sick. The list goes on. But bottom line is there's something severely wrong with that doe. So when you're seeing a healthy doe walk through the woods with no fawns, it's likely that maybe there's a severe winter, like in the case of the UP of Michigan, where they'll abort half their fawns or more during a hard winter. Maybe even all their fawns during a harsh winter. Predators certainly get their fair share of fawns. Cars, unfortunately, I've hit a couple fawns, terrible. But it does happen. Fawns die of all sorts of ailments, and even I've seen fawns dying of severe tick infestation, where they actually go blind, and then they can't feed, they can't fend for themselves, and that was a problem. Excuse me, I believe it was in Missouri this year, and that could be widespread. But there's a lot of reasons that a doe does not have fawns, and so making a harvest decision on does, choosing to shoot does in the first place because a doe either has fawns or it doesn't have fawns, should really not be a part of your overall decision-making process. Now, if a doe does have fawns, whether you shoot her accidentally or on purpose, those fawns are going to survive. And even in the case in the UP of Michigan where does and doe family groups, deer in general, are yarding sometimes 12 to 15 miles away from their core spring, summer, and early fall range, then those fawns just hook up with the rest of the deer herd, and they travel, and they become part of that deer herd, and they will be taken in, basically. They're not going to be pushed away, and they have to be taught that route to the deer yards. It's not instinctual, and so they will survive. And when you look at areas where there's not winter mortality, which is the majority of the Midwest, and certainly down to the south, then you don't have to worry about fawn survival. So especially some of those does, if you're in an area where you have lots of deer and you need to take does, then taking a big old doe that's producing twins every year or whatever it might be a wise choice. For one, you're getting a lot more meat, but two, you're taking a wise old doe out of the herd. I find that in areas with a lot of does, that the lower the age of the doe in general, the lower the experience level and the amount of wisdom the average doe in that herd has. And so whether they're picking you out of your stands, scenting you on the way to your stands, seeing you, hearing you, I'd certainly want to have a lower doe age structure on the property if I was in an area that had no winter mortality and high fawn production rates. Now, that leads to another point. When you're talking about doe harvest and you're making the decision to harvest does, and I mentioned this before, and even Dylan that edits with me, he talked about personal responsibility and making choices. Just because you have doe tags doesn't mean you need to fill them. At the same time, just because you can't get more doe tags doesn't mean you can't get father and son combinations, other hunters that are looking for a mentor, whether young hunters, boys, girls that just don't have someone to take them hunting. You can always find someone to take out on the property and harvest does, and that's if needed. And it was interesting, in 2004, the QDMA gave me their Al Brothers Deer Manager of the Year award, and it was based on deer management efforts out of their membership base, maybe 40,000 members at that time across the country. And I had managed a property for 5 years in the UP of Michigan without shooting a doe, and I thought it was a stark contrast compared to some deer management groups, even some that were up there in the UP of Michigan, where they talked about, well, if we have QDM in there, you have to shoot does. They're going to shoot all the does, and we can't have QDM. And it was just fear tactics. And obviously, as a QDM proponent and advocate, that you just because you shoot does or not doesn't mean that you're practicing QDM. If you don't have a lot of deer, don't shoot deer. Don't shoot does, that is. try to increase the population. If you have a lot, then shoot some does. It's pretty simple. Just because you have tags or not doesn't mean that that should make your harvest decision as far as numbers of deer to take. So we have a little personal responsibility when it comes to doe harvest. So, you know, for one, looking at that doe, dry doe or not, you know, that shouldn't be your decision to harvest a doe, because a dry doe, you know, theory is just a myth. And at the same time, if you have tags, doesn't mean you need to shoot does. And the last person you should be blaming about the deer numbers on your land is the DNR in the State Department or your neighbors. You have a lot of power when it comes to controlling deer numbers, especially when it comes to does. If you don't have a lot of does on your property and you have 40 acres of private land, you're probably not doing a good job managing the habitat. This is an example right here where we have these food plots out here. We sat with Diane last night. We watched 9 does and fawns. Now, depending on the numbers that we see coming up here in the muzzleloader season, the end of gun season, we'll make the choice to shoot 2 or 3 of those does or not. But bottom line is we can hold those does here every single day. They're living within 200 yards of those food plots. They're coming to the food plots every afternoon, and then they leave the property after dark. So we have a huge amount of control, whether we push those does off, whether we shoot them, whether we hold them, how we attract them, and how many that we attract. Now, when we shoot does, there is a good time and a bad time. The worst, absolute worst time to shoot does is opening day of gun season. That should be a time when your property is just the most secure, the least risk factor to deer. You want to hold deer, you want to hold young bucks, you want to attract them. You want to be the only person in the area where people are out driving ATVs through, overhunting stands, overpressuring food plots. You want to be able to collect those deer on your land and advance them to the next age class if you want. And oh, by the way, if you want to control the population, then you can make the decision in the late season to take out some does or not. But the middle of the season, the heart of the season, shooting a couple does on opening day and having to go get them, the disruption of shooting them in the first place, whatever other deer are around, just a big no-no. And if you want to increase your numbers, that's the worst thing to do. If you want to control a buck herd, if you want to advance a buck age structure to the next age class, if you want to improve sex ratios, if you want to improve buck age structures, the worst thing you can do is shoot a bunch of does on opening day, the second day of gun season, and push those deer off your property to your neighbors that might not have the same goals that you do. They're not your deer, but if you're trying to create a balanced herd, you have to make personal decisions that are responsible. So knowing when to shoot does. I love the early season with a bow, very non-invasive. I'm not a big fan of taking out a huge number of does during the early seasons. I like to have those deer during the season, a certain number of deer. But when it comes to the late season, perfect time to take does. We've already passed through the heart of the season. You've already passed that time where if your property has passed the test with a local deer herd and you've been able to hold and attract young bucks, older bucks, have a great hunt, and then you can maintain the population with making responsible decisions when you get into December. In Wisconsin, we're so fortunate because we have a 4-day doe hunt at the end of muzzleloader, and it's an awesome time to take out some does. We're not hurting the land. If we do spook them away for a month, that's okay. There's hardly one hunting around us, neighbors anyways. Hardly anybody's hunting in December for the most part, late December, especially into January. So making good choices when you shoot a doe or not, making wise choices when it comes to using your tags or not, and then certainly when it comes to that good old dry doe myth, making sure that you aren't making a harvest decision for does based on if a doe is dry or not, because they're not dry really unless they're very sick, diseased, or dying. So I'm hoping you can have a great hunt this year and you're making great decisions, and I hope you've had a great hunt. We have lots of deer management strategies on the channel, quite a few playlists, I think 20 playlists from bow hunting tips to trail cameras, to hunting nocturnal bucks, to thermals, hunting in the hills, all kinds of food plots, hinge cutting, bedding areas, whatever it might be. Lots of different strategies on this channel. I hope you enjoy them, and I hope you enjoy me dispelling this dry doe myth. It's one of those big ones that's been out there and passed along for generations, and it's just not true.